Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Thank you for your time. Goodbye. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. 27 MPs have been suspended by the Rajya Sabha and the Lok Sabha in this week alone, making Parliament the biggest subject of the day. And that leads me to ask, how effectively is our Parliament functioning? Is it living up to our expectations, or is it letting us down? That's the key issue I shall explore today with one of India's better known parliamentarians. He served both in the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, and he's been a cabinet minister for 10 years. Kapil Sibal. Kapil Sibal, I want to talk to you about the functioning of Parliament in a country that boasts of being the world's largest democracy. In your eyes, is Parliament living up to your expectations, or is it letting us down?
It's become a dysfunctional institution. I mean, I think when the constitution makers thought of a Parliament, and we are 1.5 billion people, they never thought that Parliament will work for 2%, 6%, 7%, 15% of the time. And in 2010, I think the lowest in the history of India, it worked 2% of the time during the alleged 2G scam.
But you mean that strong word, dysfunctional?
It has become dysfunctional. Where is the debate? Where is the meeting of minds? Where is the government reaching out to the opposition? Where is the opposition saying, okay, let's debate this issue?
So it's dysfunctional at many levels?
At many levels, absolutely. And the chairman is now making decisions on their own, unfortunately.
Let's explore some of the points that you've raised, and I'll go through them one by one. It seems over the decades, the Lok Sabha, which is by far the more powerful of the two houses of the Indian Parliament, has been working for less and less time.
Correct.
The 16th Lok Sabha, which is the last full-term Lok Sabha, worked for 1615 hours,
Correct.
which is 40% lower than the average for full-term Lok Sabhas. How worried are you by this trend, that the amount of time diminishes Lok Sabha by Lok Sabha?
I'm very, very worried indeed, because this is the time that should be concentrated on legislations being passed. Members of Parliament looking at legislations, committees looking at legislation, matters going to the standing committee or the select committee. And in the select and the standing committee, there is very little partisan politics. So you will come out with some solutions for the people. Now, if you don't send them there, if you don't debate it, it's just the executive running roughshod over others.
So if the amount of time the Lok Sabha sits is diminishing Lok Sabha by Lok Sabha, that also presumably means that Parliament's capacity, the Lok Sabha's capacity to fulfill its duties is also diminishing.
That's why I said it's dysfunctional.
One of the prime duties is the scrutiny of legislation.
Yes.
During the 15th Lok Sabha, 26% of bills were passed with 30 minutes or less scrutiny.
Correct.
That may have improved in the 16th Lok Sabha to 6%, but correspondingly, the number of bills that are sent to committees for scrutiny has fallen to 25% compared to 71% and 60% in the earlier Lok Sabha. So let me ask you, how effectively is the Lok Sabha scrutinizing legislation, or is it failing to do its duty?
Well, you know, what can I say? It's certainly not scrutinizing legislation at all. It's not allowing others to scrutinize legislation. I remember, and I'll tell you the example of the Rajya Sabha. When I was there and the vice president nominee was there of the Congress party, whenever there was disruption in the House and the Treasury benches, we were in the Treasury benches, said to him, let's pass legislation. He said, no, I will not allow any legislation to be passed without a debate. So in our time, we could not pass that legislation.
Now the opposite
it's
is
the
happening.
opposite. Now it's the opposite, because the Treasury benches now say pass legislation in the din of the House, and the chairman happily agrees.
So if only 25% of legislation is going to committees for scrutiny and the rest is literally passed on the nod, then it clearly means that Parliament is not fulfilling its duty of scrutinizing legislation carefully and diligently.
Yeah, but the 25% also has another story to it. That 25% are non-issue, non-issue bills that don't really raise any complex issues. When it comes to real legislation, like PMLA and this, that and the other,
there's no scrutiny.
There is no scrutiny, like the J&K bill. Where is the scrutiny?
So clearly, in terms of fulfilling its duty of scrutinizing legislation, Parliament is failing, or maybe it's failed.
I think it has failed.
Let's come to the second big duty of Parliament, and the Lok Sabha in particular, and that is to hold the government to account. But the government refuses to make time for subjects that the opposition consider important, like price rise and GST at the moment. When opposition MPs protest, they are suspended, as has happened to 27 in this week alone.
Yes.
So would you say that in terms of the second duty of the Lok Sabha, holding the government to account, once again, the Lok Sabha is failing?
Again, absolutely right. And the reason why it's failing is the following. What is the opposition asking? Let's have a discussion on the price rise and the GST, right? And they are saying the finance minister is not well. As and when she gets well, we'll have a discussion. But on many occasions in the past, and price rise relates to the Consumer Affairs Ministry, not necessarily the Finance Ministry, because a lot of these prices are in consumer goods. So he can well answer, and many times in the past, the Defense Minister has answered for other ministers, for the Home Minister has answered for the Defense Minister. Why should the government make this excuse? And if the debate goes on, we not have so many days wasted in Parliament. So obviously they're happy to do it because they're getting their legislation passed without debate.
The net result is not only is there no discussion on important issues like price rise and GST, but as a result of there being no discussion, the government isn't held to account, and therefore the function of Parliament of holding the government to account isn't happening at all.
Absolutely.
In this context, let me ask you, is suspending MPs the best way of disciplining them, or is that the wrong approach to people who are elected to represent, debate and discuss?
There is no need to suspend them. You have a discussion on price rise, have your Minister for Consumer Affairs, have your Home Minister, have other senior cabinet minister answer that. What's the problem with that?
So suspending MPs because they're protesting in the well of the House or carrying placards is the wrong way of handling the problem?
Absolutely. It's no solution to the problem. In fact, there's a tamasha before the people of this country, or 1.5 billion people. See what's happening to our elected representatives and what they are doing to our elected representatives.
So suspending actually doesn't solve the problem, it aggravates it.
Absolutely. And disruption is not the answer.
So let me then sum up what we've done. We've established that in terms of the two key duties that Parliament has to perform, scrutinizing legislation and holding the government to account, it's failing on both counts.
Absolutely. And I want to just add something, if you don't mind. And the reason why I want to add this is, look at the double-faced attitude of the present party. I'll give you something. In 2012, on January 30, 2011, Mr. Jaitley, who was then in the opposition, said parliamentary obstruction is not undemocratic.
He said it was a part of parliamentary strategy.
No, that's later. But he said parliamentary obstruction is not undemocratic. Then on August 26, 2012, he said disruption does not mean not doing work. What we are doing is in fact very important work. Sometimes disruptions bring greater gains to the country. And then he said legitimate tactic for opposition to expose the government. And then Sushma Swaraj said it is for government to run parliament, not for the opposition. So not allowing parliament to function is a form of democracy.
So the point you're making is that the opposition today is doing exactly what Jaitley and Sushma Swaraj did earlier, but you did not in your time suspend them.
No.
They, however, have chosen to suspend you.
Absolutely. What was undemocratic, democratic then has become undemocratic now in their eyes.
So there's hypocrisy involved here as well, double standards.
Absolutely.
Okay, we've spent the first part of this interview talking about where Parliament is failing, and we've established that its two key duties of scrutinizing legislation and holding the government account are simply not being performed. It's failed.
Absolutely.
You agree, failed is the right
failed.
word.
It's absolutely. This is not how parliaments are expected to function.
Let's then at this point come to remedial action that could revitalize Parliament, because in a sense that is what you've written about and that is what I believe the country wants to hear.
Yes.
To begin with, rather than let the government of the day decide for how many days and how many weeks Parliament will function, should there be a fixed schedule that stipulates Parliament each year will function and sit for so many days, full stop?
But who will decide that schedule, and in what manner will that be decided? I agree with it. In other countries of the world, the UK, the US, Germany, the schedule is decided by the elected house well in advance. But there's not so much, animosity. Within political parties. They know the duty they owe to the nation and decide. Here the governor calls the session. Now if you give this power to the ruling party, the treasury benches, they can call the house at any time.
Clearly it can't be given to the ruling party or the treasury benches on its own. It has to be in consultation and concurrence with the opposition. In other words, Parliament itself as a body, opposition and government together have to decide how many days Parliament will sit for.
Correct.
But not the government on its own.
That's right. That's the point I make.
But you think this is a necessary change?
It's a necessary, but it requires a constitutional amendment.
And would you also say that Parliament needs to sit for at least 100 days a year?
No, more. You see, a country like the US, in the US, the House on an average sits about 150 days a year. The Senate on an average also about 164 days.
We need to approximate that.
We are a much bigger population. See, we're 1.5 billion people.
So we should exceed that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Though the review committee for the amendment of the Justice Venkachalaya's committee had suggested 120 days for Lok Sabha and 100 days, minimum of 100 days. But even that's not been followed.
Let's come to a second change that might revitalize Parliament. Should there be agreed number of days each week, or at least an agreed day each week, when the opposition will decide the agenda and choose the subjects that are discussed, and the government cannot disagree or demur?
That's absolutely necessary, because we are living in the colonial past, that the government of the day, the treasury benches will decide which topics the opposition will discuss. Who are they to decide?
This requires a change in the rules. The Business Management Committee will have to function differently.
That can easily be done. But why would the treasury benches do it? Because they don't want uncomfortable discussions to take place in the House.
But you believe that this is a change that is necessary to revitalize?
Without this, Parliament cannot be the institution that people want it to be.
Let's come to a third possible change that could revitalize Parliament, and I'm deliberately repeatedly using that word revitalize because it needs to be re-energized.
Yes.
Do we need to adopt the House of Commons practice of Prime Minister's question time, whereby on a given day of the week, which is a fixed day, the Prime Minister is questioned by the opposition, and the opposition in turn has the right to make accountable the most important person in the country?
Absolutely necessary. Absolutely. See, we must legitimize or re-legitimize this institution. This is the problem. Today, in the eyes of the public, it has become a place where people just don't do anything except disruption. No work is done.
So you need a formal day and a fixed time when the Prime Minister is held to account directly and personally.
Yes, and he must answer all questions that are asked, and the chair should not say you can't answer that question.
This is the second critical bit. In Britain, Prime Minister's question time works effectively because the Speaker is ruthless in enforcing discipline. John Bercow, when he was Speaker of the House of Commons, wouldn't hesitate to reprimand Boris Johnson. On one or two occasions, he even made him apologize.
I've seen it on YouTube, him doing that.
But will our Speaker function the same way?
No, why shouldn't it? He should leave. He should disaffiliate himself from the party. Then only he can do it.
Well, let's come to this, because speakers in India, even after they're elected, continue to be members of their party.
Yes.
In Britain, and I'm going back to Britain.
Yes.
Speakers resign the moment they get elected.
Correct.
And secondly, if the sitting Speaker wishes to stand for election again, he or she is unopposed.
Absolutely.
Should both those conventions be adopted?
Yes. The Speaker must resign. Must not be associated with the party anymore. Otherwise, how do you conduct the House? And this is the problem.
This would guarantee the impartiality and
neutrality. I don't know whether
it
will guarantee, but there's some element.
But it would help.
Yes, it will certainly help.
And would it also help ensure that the Speaker enforces discipline on the Prime Minister if we adopt Prime Minister's question time?
Yes, yes. He must not only disaffiliate himself, he must also not take up any post after his term of office is over. In other words, he should not look at any freebies, he should not look at any advantage from the government for having served the treasury benches, even though he may have resigned.
But that is something that isn't imposed upon cabinet ministers or prime ministers. They can take up other jobs after retiring.
That's different.
Why not the Speaker?
That's because you get elected. Now it's like the Chief Justice of India or judges of the Supreme Court who should not be taking jobs. Once you're a Speaker of the House, you're above the party.
So the standard for the Speaker will have to be a higher one than the standard for cabinet ministers.
Much higher, much higher. We are political people. He'll be non-political, non-partisan.
Okay, now in India, as far as I understand, the rules of parliament do not permit discussion on a subject that is deemed to be sub-judice. But this rule seems to be applied pretty erratically or selectively. For instance, Bofors has been discussed, even though it was technically sub-judice, but Pegasus or the Rafale deal have not been discussed.
Correct.
So first of all, do we need a clear ruling on what is and what is not sub-judice?
I think there's a distinction between discussing a matter which is in court or discussing a matter which is at the stage of investigation. If you start discussing a matter at the stage of investigation, it impacts the investigation. So I think that should not happen. But if you start discussing a matter when the matter is in court, it doesn't really matter.
To put this in layman's language, are you saying that sub-judice applies when court is actually hearing a case?
That's right.
It doesn't apply
Yes.
simply because the case is listed for future hearing on an undecided date.
Correct. And when the matter is in investigation, so many matters come up in the course of investigation, which should not be the subject matter of public debate. Because then what happens is you start accusing the person of wrongdoing when he may not have done any wrongdoing. And then that influences the mind of the investigator. That should never happen.
So the excuse, we can't discuss it in sub-judice, is not a valid excuse.
No.
It doesn't fulfill the requirements of sub-judice.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Let's come to scrutiny. So far we've talked about the hours that Parliament should function. We've talked about how the government and the Prime Minister in particular should be made accountable. Let's come to scrutiny. As I pointed out to you, barely 25% of legislation actually is sent to committees to be scrutinized. The rest seems to get passed literally on the nod,
That's
sometimes
right.
without even proper discussion.
Correct.
Should we push up that 25% to pretty close to 50 or above?
You should. In fact, if you ask me, all legislation must be scrutinized. Not necessarily, because what happens is when you send it to a standing committee in between sessions, this report comes in the next session. So there's no real gap. Many legislations impact the country on a long-term basis. And if you do not scrutinize them carefully, you actually are doing disservice to the nation.
So are you saying that actually the default should be all legislation should go to committees?
Yes.
It is the exceptional bill that does not
correct.
go.
That's correct. And that's when there is consensus, no need to have to send it to the committee.
So-
just the opposite.
So committees are the rule,
Yes.
not the exception.
That's correct. That's my suggestion.
Which also means that pretty close to 90% of legislation
Should go.
will go through the committee route.
Should go. Because legislations impact future generations. I mean, a law made today will impact for the next 5 years or 10 years.
Should there also be a requirement stringently observed? I know it technically exists, but should it be stringently observed that legislation must be made available to MPs a good 2-3 days before it's tabled so they can study it?
Well, sometimes it is sent. In the Business Advisory Committee, the items of legislation or the bills are set out. These are going to be discussed. And so members of parliament can actually access them.
But the actual bill should be sent to them in advance of it being discussed.
They can access
it.
Yes.
Now, I want to raise with you two other issues. First, the anti-defection law, which many believe has emasculated MPs, has converted people who are as elected representatives free to voice their conscience into slaves of their party leadership. And this is because if they vote against the directions of their party whip, or they take up in public a position contrary to their party leadership, they are deemed defectors and therefore lose their seat in parliament. Do you agree with the view that the anti-defection law as a result has fundamentally changed the character of MPs? It's made them slaves.
There are two aspects of this that I want to place before you. Number one, the Supreme Court in Kyoto Holohan, a 5-judge bench, has held that the whip should only be used on 2 occasions. Number one, when the finance bill is presented. Because if the finance bill is not passed,
The government falls.
has to fall. And two, when there's a no confidence motion, then also government
So
falls.
only when the survival of the government is at stake.
Correct. Or on such an important issue that is part of the fundamental, of the core manifesto of a political party. Maybe on that, but not otherwise.
So ipso facto, the anti-defection bill or law will only apply to the finance bill and votes of no confidence.
Correct, but our voice is silenced by the party issuing a whip at every stage.
You're saying that in fact MPs should be free to disagree, dissent and differ from their party leadership on all other issues.
What happens in England, what happens in the US is the president, who is of the Democratic Party, will reach out to the Republicans to have his bills passed. What did Obama do for the health bill? He sought the support of the Republicans as well. The same thing happens because there is no such concept as a whip.
And it's because MPs can't differ, disagree and dissent from their leadership,
yes.
then they end up becoming slaves to their leadership.
Absolutely. So this is completely undemocratic, and according to me, it's violative of the fundamental rights of a member of parliament to speak in the House.
What are we talking about? Amending the anti-defection law or scrapping it?
You have to scrap it, but there's another aspect.
Scrap it.
Completely. We don't need the anti-defection law. Why should you need the We only need one provision. Anybody who changes his party while he is an elected member of a house should not be allowed to be a candidate in the next 5 years for an election in the Lok Sabha or any body, and not hold a public post for the next 5 years.
But with that as an exception,
Yes.
differing from your party leadership in terms of your views on issues that had nothing to do with the finance bill or a voter confidence,
That's fine.
should be fine.
Yes,
You said there were two aspects of this. What's the second aspect?
The second aspect is what happens today is that anti-defection was meant to ensure that there are no defections. But the very legislation now, the 10th schedule, is used to in fact incentivize elections. Because now what is happening is, under the law today, unless you are two-third, you can merge with another party. Now, if you are two-third, you can actually destroy an elected government, supplant an elected government.
And you can circumvent the anti-defection law by resigning and then getting re-elected later on and becoming a minister in the interim.
In which country in the world is an elected government can be brought down by this kind of shenanigans?
This is why you believe the anti-defection law must be scrapped.
Absolutely.
Completely scrapped.
And there should be a provision in the Constitution that you should not hold any public office for 5 years. You should not be a candidate in an election.
This is the deterrent or the penalty.
That's the only way. Nobody will defect.
The second issue I want to discuss with you is the Rajya Sabha, the house of which you are a member at the moment. Constitutionally, it was envisaged as a revising chamber where legislation passed by the Lok Sabha could be considered once again. And secondly, as a chamber which would give expression to the interests and concerns of the states.
Right.
The first revising chamber aspect has been undermined by the anti-defection law because you cannot disagree with what your party leadership has done in the Lok Sabha. And the second, an area where the sentiments and the interests of the states are considered, is undermined by the fact that in 2003 legislation was passed snapping the link between states and election to the Rajya Sabha. So my question is simple. As a result, has the Rajya Sabha lost its raison d'etre in the Indian system?
No, it really doesn't matter, because even if you snap the link, if I am representing Uttar Pradesh, for example, what is happening in Uttar Pradesh will be reflected by me in the House when I stand up and speak. So that's not a problem. The real problem about the second chamber is in fact the following. Nowadays in the Lok Sabha, in the finance bill, they include legislation which has nothing to do with the money bill.
To circumvent the Rajya Sabha.
To circumvent the Rajya Sabha. And so many of the amendments which would otherwise come to the Rajya Sabha and would perhaps be defeated are put in the money bill to ensure that the Rajya Sabha does not debate.
But what you're doing is to question the Speaker's sole right to decide what is or what isn't a money bill.
Absolutely. And that's
Who should that power go to? Because speakers are clearly partisan and decide in favor of the government.
It is defined in the Constitution, 110, 109 of the Constitution.
What does it say?
What is a money bill? Anything that relates to demands of grants, for example, is a money bill. Anything that relates to the finance. Now, an amendment of the PMLA has nothing to do with finance.
Except that the power to decide what is or isn't a money bill is left to the Speaker, and if the Speaker decides wrongly, there's nothing you can do.
That's the problem.
Like the Aadhaar Act.
The problem, no, that is true, but that matter is pending in Supreme
Absolutely.
Court. But the decision of the Speaker has to be consistent with Article 110.
How do we ensure it is?
Well, the Supreme Court will have to rule.
But you can't keep going back to the Supreme Court. Is there no committee that you can set up which is bipartisan, which would decide together what is or isn't a money bill? Because otherwise, you can have a partisan speaker exercising his rights. There may be questions in the Supreme Court, but it precludes the Rajya Sabha all the time.
Once the Supreme Court rules that any legislation which has nothing to do with finance, right, cannot be included in the finance bill, the problem will be solved.
So you're saying once the Supreme Court rules,
yes,
the matter will be resolved. But the Supreme Court needs to rule quickly. The Aadhaar Act has been sitting in front of the Supreme Court for many years.
All the PMLA amendments which are retrospective are part of the money bill.
And a 7-judge bench has to be appointed to hear it, but the Supreme Court isn't acting with great haste.
I don't want to say anything about that.
We've discussed, Kapil Sibal, several changes, amendments and in the way the Parliament functions, which if they were to be implemented, would certainly revitalize Parliament very, very considerably.
Correct.
But how confident are you that any of these things that we've talked about will actually happen?
They won't. Because power politics, hunger for power, desire to retain power, destroy institutions, continue to be in power.
In other words,
that is what fundamentally...
The dysfunctional character of our Parliament will not only continue, there's a danger it could get worse.
It is getting worse by the day. It is getting worse by the day. Which is the institution that stands up today?
In other words,
take the Election Commission. I'm sorry to say, take other institutions. They're all captured. The two pillars of democracy are the media and the courts. The media, the mainstream media has already failed us, and the courts are slowly failing us.
But what you're saying about Parliament, and I'm coming back to Parliament, is that not only has it failed, but the situation is going to get worse.
Yes.
It's already dysfunctional, but it's steadily and progressively getting worse.
That's right.
And this means we know what we need to do to check the rot and remedy the situation, but it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
In other words, our inability as a country to correct the situation, even though we know what is needed to correct it, is going to make the situation worse. In the end, we will be to blame.
Absolutely. And we need a national movement. We need a new national movement. We need people of this country to come up and say, we want this to happen.
And only then will it happen.
And only will it happen.
But the people of India need to raise their voice and say,
it's
enough is enough.
It is the ordinary citizen who must raise his voice. And it must not be politicians who must lead them. It's the people.
So the onus to act is on the people of India.
Yes, it's the
only they can save their parliament.
That's number one. Number two, wherever in the world you've gone, and if you look at the history of the world, all great movements have been started by lawyers. It's time for the lawyers to come forward and stand up for the people of India.
So the people of India, and within the people of India, lawyers in particular.
That's right.
The onus is on them.
That's right.
And if they don't act, if they don't speak out, the rot will get worse.
They should blame themselves for not doing what they should be doing.
Kapil Sibal, for speaking so openly, thank you very much indeed. I hope the people of India and your own fraternity, the lawyers, are listening and act.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.